So let's go ahead and get started. I want to introduce our special guest here today. This is Charles Hall. And Charles is a distinguished User Defenders community member. I want to put that out there on the outset. And he's been an amazing contributor to many conversations, many resources shared. And so he's there, folks that aren't a part of the community yet. He's there. He adds a lot of value, especially as it relates to what we're going to talk about today, what he's going to talk about today. This is all about accessibility and inclusive design, and definitely a very important area of our field. It's been so neat to see the importance of these topics really blowing up in our field, because it's important, and it's kind of sad and maybe a little embarrassing at how long these important issues have kind of gone overlooked. But nevertheless, here we are. We can only change today and tomorrow, given the opportunity. So I'm glad to see so much.
Unless you have a DeLorean.
Unless you have a DeLorean. Very well said. Yes. And man, wouldn't that be neat to have that? So yeah, so that's the good thing. And I'm really glad to see Charles has been at this for a long time. So he and there's a lot of other people too that have been really making a lot of stride toward making things better in this area for all of us and educating all of us. So I'm really thrilled to have you here, Charles. Thanks for being here, man.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Charles has been designing since 1988. He's been developing since 1993, entrepreneurial since 1996. He's been in agencies since 2000, accessibility since 2008. He's at MRM McCann since 2012 and W3C since 2013, mentoring since 2014, UX all throughout. So we got the right guy here to talk about this stuff and to answer all of our questions today. So yeah, Charles, I wanted to start I got a couple on the outset here. I want to start with what's your why? I feel like Simon Sinek famously said, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Why are you so passionate about this stuff?
Yeah, and I love that quote. And thank you for asking, because I think it's important that all of us share those sort of backstories. I have two. One is back in 2006, I was part of a team that built a product that served a small business community, and that product was entirely Flash-based. And after it launched, I learned that there's this thing called accessibility, and Flash isn't accommodating of pretty much anyone. It's a closed ecosystem. I'm sure everyone remembers some part of how Flash impacted the web. And that was actually one of the sort of instances in our industry that led to the state that we're in now. So the Wild West of the web is, let's make everything look cool. And that came at a cost. So in 2007, when this product launched, I started learning about accessibility, and I've never turned back. The second reason or why is personal. I'm a lot older than I look, and like all humans, I suffer from the fact that we are all temporarily abled, and vision is among one of the things that is in that category for me. I am currently looking at you through a set of multifocal contact lenses. I generally have these on over the top of them so that I can see anything beyond the screen in front of me. So I'm losing my vision along the way, so it's personal. I need things to work for me.
Yeah, I totally identify with you. And in fact, I noticed, I think we have the same frames. Are those Ray-Bans?
Not sure.
I think yeah, see? All right,
Pretty
man,
similar,
I like your
yeah.
style. Good stuff. Yeah, you know what's funny is I I beat the odds by a year, my optometrist said. I'm 44 now. When I was 43, I had to get glasses. So he said, typically by the age 42, pretty much everybody needs some sort of aid, assistive device like glasses, right? So, it's interesting. C Domo, PX, as we know him in the community, he actually had a question about this, and he says he's added an assistive device or needs to his person. He's also wearing glasses, but he's wondering, are there some best practices to follow for communicating the constraints of a project to the team? Do you need elaboration on that?
I'm going to try and, yeah, probably. So it sounds like the question is whether or not there are constraints on the communication itself. So let's make sure we get that question right.
Yeah. PX, do you want to elaborate on that?
So I went to a workshop. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
And it was done by a large company here in Seattle. You can take your guess at a variety of them. And they decided not to use personas. And instead of using personas, they would just identify the constraints. And I was kind of in between because I'm kind of a newbie. So I've added to my personas a category of assisted devices. And so, which really can be a variety of different things. So the question is basically, if you don't use a communication tool like personas, but you want, and you're designing and you're focusing on the constraints of, like for your project, how do you communicate that to the team if you're not using a tool like personas? I don't know, does that make any sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. So the first thing that I would say is it's fine to use whatever tool works for your team in communicating what users need and what the product needs. So I advocate against personas in the traditional sense. So the academic old school model of a persona tends to include things that are more demographic in nature than are useful to design to. So it doesn't matter, and it ultimately becomes a bias whether or not the user has specific age or race or social economic status or any of the demographics we use to group and categorize people. Those are not useful. They are useful to a marketer. They're useful to analytics. They're useful to sort of understand whether or not your reach is excluding people, but they're not useful to design to. What is useful is what you identified as a constraint I would call a functional need. So there are ways to modify those traditional personas to remove all the demographic information and introduce all the functional need information. So Microsoft has one called, let me see if I remember, there's one idea out there of persona layers that basically says, here's all the characteristics of the task-based need that the user has, and then layer on top of that the functional need that they have in order to do that task. And then there's things like Indy Young's mental models, which is basically a persona that focuses on what the user understanding of the task that they're trying to accomplish in order to accommodate the need that they have underlying it. So you can use whatever tool works for your team in order to communicate. Again, you call them constraints, I call them functional needs. For example, I'll go off on a little tangent here. There are basically two ways that people normally talk about disability, and it is disability first language that says a blind person. And then there is people first language that says a person who cannot see. If you take the personal identity out of that and you instead talk about the functional need, all you have to say is use without vision. And then it doesn't matter who the person is, because then that accommodates all of the other contexts in which a person might not be able to see. For example, I might be able to start navigating a page and leave the room and have some sort of assisted technology continue reading it for me when I'm not in the room. Doesn't mean that I lack vision, it means that I cannot see the content. So if you focus instead on the functional need, you'll cover all of the needs of someone with that limitation inability. Does that make sense?
I think it does. Yeah, that's a great answer. What do you think?
Thanks, Charles.
So right now this is a time I want to prioritize questions from folks who are here live right now. So this is a time to, if you have a question for Charles, go ahead and unmute your line and please feel free to ask. I do have some questions that I can ask, and some of you are here right now that you've submitted your questions to me. If you'd rather ask him personally right now, that's totally great. I'll listen and I'll check it off as one that has been asked, but I want to prioritize any questions from the folks who are actually here right now live. So this is your chance, this is your time to ask your questions. So feel free to do that.
Hey, Charles, this is Ellen.
Hi, Ellen.
Hi, I have a question. I'm like a visual user interface designer. I guess that's my specialty within UX. And what would you say to someone just looking at the visuals of how to design for accessibility? What are the important things to check for?
That is a great question. And the unfortunate answer is everything. So what you start to, it's like developing a muscle. So for example, you start noticing things that that matter to you personally, and then you grow from there to start noticing other things. For example, if you are someone who is offended by gender identity being too narrow, and a form asking you for male or female and omitting an other or none option, you'll notice that because it has an immediate impact on you. Likewise, you'll notice bias in any other category that does. And then because you notice that, it helps that muscle building of recognizing bias elsewhere. So visually, some of the things that are accessibility issues are actually easy to notice for most of us. At least those of us, I should characterize that as most of us that can see it. Things like color contrast being insufficient, like size being insufficient, or proximity being insufficient, elements that are interactive, that are too close to each other to engage with if you have a challenge with fine motor control, things like that. The thing that becomes a challenge is understanding the severity of impact of those things. So it's really easy to recognize when something has insufficient color contrast, and it's one of the most pervasive problems on the web. but the human impact of that is not as severe as many of the other accessibility shortcomings in visual design these days. One that probably has a bigger impact is things moving, right? So you have animation and media clips and CSS transitions and things like that. If things move in response to a human action and they move predictably and they move slowly and they have the ability to be turned off, those are all good things. If they do so automatically, or they're fast, or they're jarring, or they lack the ability to turn them off, then they're a problem. And the human impact of that is pretty severe. So those are the kinds of things that you learn gradually, but recognizing them gets easier over time and in volume.
Yeah.
Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
I like that. I was thinking about, again, I mentioned it earlier about how far we've come, but how there's still a lot of work to do. And right. I like how when I go to the movies, I'll see something right there on the box office that says, hey, by the way, Toy Story 4 has some jarring images or flickering. And if you are sensitive to seizures, you want to keep that in mind. Like I appreciate seeing that. It shows me that somebody had the empathy to actually take the time to communicate that. Whereas before, I mean, it's like, I don't ever remember when I was a kid, I don't ever remember seeing signs like that, or even as a teenager. I don't remember that. And I feel like that's good. It's sort of like, hey, enter at your own risk. Like we're going to try to serve like 80% or 70% of the people walking through these doors. So I like seeing that. And like when I watch, and like on Netflix, I don't subscribe to Netflix, but my son did a trial and I'm glad he did, because I got to watch Stranger Things 3, chapter 3. But I appreciate how in the beginning of every one of those episodes, it says, caution, there's flickering images in these episodes. And so you want to be aware of that. I appreciate that. What do you think, Charles?
Yeah, so that's wonderful. And I do notice a trend in, I would say, awareness has ticked up a bit. Solutions, maybe not so much, but awareness has. The one that's parallel to the one that you just mentioned is sensory issues. There are live environments like theme parks. For example, Sesame Street has a theme park where you can actually physically go observe all kinds of cool installations, much like a Disneyland kind of thing. And all of their exhibits have sensory information signs in front of them. So if you have a kid with autism, you'll be aware ahead of time, like you can be selective which exhibits you go and check out. So those kinds of early warning signs are all great. But even better than that is learning how to design those things where there are no sensory issues, right? So recognizing it and warning people is a good baby step. Removing them is a better step. So back to motion design for a quick second is just like most of the things that we advocate for being user defenders is put the user in control, or at least don't take away the control that they already have. So motion actually has a media query. So at the operating system level, a person can opt out of motion. Basically, they say prefer reduced motion, and there's a media query for that. So if you have motion on your website, you can put it inside of that media query, so anyone that has that setting on their machine doesn't see your motion.
Wow, I had no idea about that. Did not know that existed. That is fascinating. Who's got more questions? Jump on in.
You can type a question in the chat window if you're uncomfortable going off mute and speaking it, because I have the chat window open as well.
Yeah, great point.
Hi, Charles. This is Chris.
Hey, Chris.
How are you?
All right.
Good. I have a question. So accessibility has been talked about at a couple of companies that I've worked out in the past, but still was an afterthought during the design process. Can you talk about the benefit of accessibility when considered and implemented at the very start of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest one is cost and rework, right? So if you design a thing and ship a thing and then discover there's an issue, well, you now have about 30 times the cost in remediating that issue, because you have to go through your entire design decision-making process all over again. If you make that decision at the beginning of your process, it's free. Like, you know, for example, and this is a big myth, that accessibility is complicated and difficult and costly to do. It's not, it's free when you do it from the beginning, right? So if I'm, go back to color contrast for a second, because it's easy to pick on. If I make a decision as a visual designer between two colors that lack sufficient contrast, it's the same amount of human energy as it took to make a bad decision, or rather a good decision between two colors that have sufficient contrast. Doing things at the beginning of the process also helps build institutional knowledge, because there's a trickle-down effect of more eyes on it in process. So if I design a thing and ship a thing and learn it's inaccessible and go back through the loop, it's probably touching fewer hands than if I make it accessible from the beginning of a process, where there's a bunch of stakeholders making decisions on a thing, there's a bunch of approvers, there's a bunch of peers and cohorts that are seeing the thing in progress. It cascades out across an organization much better when it's considered at the beginning.
Thank you, Charles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's funny, Charles, you mentioned contrast. I think you mentioned it a couple times now, and that is a big pain point for sure. And there's some decisions that are made by designers where you just go, WTH, right? Like, what's going on here? I want to share. I feel like this is worthy of sharing. This is in the offline world. It's not just online. It's in the offline world too.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think that, you know, we should be striving as designers. I don't care if you're designing a website, an app, or a theme park or whatever, and fill in the blank. Like, we need to be considering these principles and these practices no matter what we're creating. And I'm going to share my screen here for a second, because I want to share with everybody a picture. I took my family and I went to the zoo recently. We have a beautiful zoo out here in Colorado Springs called the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo. And it's literally in a mountain. They built a zoo in the mountain. And it's like, I guess it's the second largest giraffe population. The first, it goes back and forth between Wild Animal Kingdom, Disney's Wild Animal Kingdom, and our zoo here. And so this was at the giraffe theme park. And I took a picture because I just could not believe this. So I built it up enough. So let me share my screen here really quick, because this is, okay, here we go. Can y'all see that? Can y'all see that picture?
Yeah, that's a win right there.
That's inexcusable. It is absolutely inexcusable. I had my glasses on. I couldn't even read this with my glasses on in person.
Yeah.
And there's no reason. There's no excuse to put type on this thing with just a shadow, with just a drop shadow behind it.
Yeah, but you know what it looks like to me, to give them the benefit of the doubt, is that there was some sort of additional plate over the top of that based on what those screws look like. Like maybe there was a red plate or something over the top of it, where
Don't
once
let them
upon a
out of
time
it.
it was easy to read. But yeah, that's horrible.
So that's an example right there. I had to share that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and of course there are actually other design challenges there. One is the distance of the shadow. So even if the text did have contrast with the background, the distance of the shadow creates a weird halo effect, which makes the readability decrease. It's center aligned, which is a problem for eye tracking and a problem for long passages of text. And then of course it doesn't have like a Braille equivalent beneath it. So
oh man,
yeah, there's a lot of challenges there.
you
And
just
see
extracted a lot more than I did from the initial look. I
exactly.
just hated it.
So that's my point, going back to this building of a muscle of being able to just immediately see bias in design. Is I've been doing this long enough where I can recognize all those things at a glance. Like it's missing this, and this.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. That is really insightful. I hadn't thought about those things. Jessica Hung. Hi, Jessica. She's also a User Defenders community member, and she has a great question she just asked here in the chat. She asks, what are the top 3 resources or tools you would recommend for someone trying to gain more understanding? In addition, like if you could recommend one thing a designer can start doing to make accessibility a part of their practice, what would that be? You mentioned building muscles. That's a great way to just start seeing it, start researching it.
Let me come back to the first question on the resources.
Yeah.
One thing a designer can start doing to make it part of their practice. So I have like I said, been doing this for a while now, and I have reaffirmed the understanding that everyone learns differently. Everyone has a different learning model. Everyone has a different trigger of what will motivate them to learn something. So the short answer is that it's different for everyone, and you have to sort of make it personal and contextual when providing advice of like one thing. But I will say that making something a habit, and if you want to learn about habits, I suggest reading work from Nir Eyal, where you hold yourself accountable to developing that habit and exercising it. So for example, when you discover that one thing that you can do, make sure that you do it consistently. The other thing that's super important is sharing what you learn as you learn it, because seeing someone learn is a motivation for a lot of people. So if you have a large team, for example, and someone is all excited and passionate about something all of a sudden, that gets noticed. So it also helps all kinds of, business goal side effects like morale and team building and all of that. But it really helps to share what you learn as you learn it. The tools, that's a hard question to answer because I personally advocate against tools like software tools being in a sort of tool obsessed culture. In user experience, everyone's promoting the latest prototyping tool and you should be doing X and et cetera. I believe in more of a holistic and intrinsic approach, is use whatever tool works for you. There are a great number of accessibility related tools out there. I have probably 20 different browser extensions myself, and I use a variety of them for a variety of needs. But the best tool isn't software, it's people. So as far as resources or tools, I think the best resources we have is each other, and particularly for accessibility is people with specific functional needs. So if you have a person on your team that you know to be colorblind, for example, it's way better to go talk to that person than to use a tool to emulate colorblindness.
I like that. Our best tools are people. That's really great. And I mean, you can.
Does that,
yeah.
did that help answer those two questions?
Jessica? Feel free to type in. Yep, she said yes, thank you.
All
Awesome.
right.
I like that. Yes, I mean, you can use a tool that is meant to serve people with a specific disability, but how much better is it to actually just try to be in the same environment as this person or this audience that we're trying to serve and trying to make sure our designs accommodate? How much better is that to do that, right?
Right. And that's really like the definition of inclusive, right? So accessibility and inclusion are different things, but they have this Venn diagram overlap where that happens. So depending on the type of environment you are in or organization or maybe you're one of those UX team of ones. I have a team of 22 people here at my agency, and I have 900 people in the office in this location. I don't have the luxury of asking someone if they have a disability because that's illegal. But this this issue of including people that have specific functional needs is super important. So how do I get people that have specific functional needs to be part of decision-making processes? And Kat Holmes, the author of Mismatch, which we had a book club on here on the User Defenders community, she actually answered this question for me, and it's throw out the bat signal. So because you can't ask, you can instead say, hey, I'm doing this thing, and people will come to you. So if you just put it out there in the universe and say, hey, this product I'm working on could be better with some input from people who are deaf, you will have someone who is deaf in your organization come and talk to you.
Oh, I love that. Throw out the bat signal. That's so good. And that makes so much sense too. It's like, how do you find people? Well, you just put a signal out into the world and people will come. If you communicate it, people will come, the right people. So I like that. That is a great takeaway. Let's see. Muriel has a great question too. She put into the chat. She wants to know about the role of accessibility in design. How much should accessibility be part of design versus development? And should they go hand in hand? And she says, for example, in her current freelance job, accessibility is just not on their mind, and they have not been very open to discussions at this point. They just hired developers, so maybe she could work with them on accessibility. What are your thoughts on that, Charles?
Yeah, so I'm going to take the first one first, design versus development. That one's fairly easy. So it's also sort of missing another discipline because for example, web content accessibility guidelines, the C is for content, right? So you can visually design and technically develop something that is fully accessible in like a component-driven design system and put it in a CMS and then have a content author fill it full of something that then breaks it. But specifically if you're looking at things that are more visually design oriented versus code or development issues, it's roughly half and half. So we recently at my agency rolled out a role-based approach to supporting accessibility, and here's how the math shook down for our teams. We said that our target was WCAG level AA compliance in version 2.1, which is 50 success criteria. Of those 50 success criteria, 8 of them are in the domain or primary domain of user experience. 19 of them are in the domain of creative, which is visual design and media production and copywriting. And then 23 of them are in the domain of technology or largely front-end development. So if you were to sort of lump the UX and creative ones together, you're looking at a split 50-50. Half of the accessibility issues in WCAG 2.1 level AA conformance have to do with things that precede development. So absolutely, they go hand in hand, and the more those things happen simultaneously, the better. So the sort of archaic waterfall workflow where visual design gets handed over the fence to a designer, I'm sure most of us would agree is slow and expensive and wrought with error. So the more that we can collaborate in real time, or at least work simultaneously in proximity to each of these disciplines, the better. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot, because I'm trying to push for that, to work with the developers more, so that kind of just affirms my thought process. So after this, I have a meeting with them, so I'll definitely be bringing it up. I have a little more confidence about what I'm going to say now.
Great, and to be fair to them, the point that I made earlier about the level of effort when you make different decisions at the beginning of the process being the same amount of effort or free, that is true for development as well, if they get to make the decisions starting from scratch. But a lot of times developers are constrained by platforms and ecosystems and legacy things that they have to work within, which does actually represent a fair amount of additional effort to get around those very real constraints. So telling a developer, you're gonna be able to make our site a lot more accessible simply by using semantic elements. That's very true and very easy when you start from scratch and you make the decision to use an article element versus a div. But it's not necessarily true when they don't have control over that without pulling a lot of extra strings.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and that's great input, Charles. And I will add, Muriel, that I just finished reading a book called Never Split the Difference by a fellow named Chris Voss. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator, and he basically wrote this book. This is going somewhere. I'm gonna somehow tie this into your question. He wrote this book all about negotiating tactics, and what he's learned a lot has been self-taught. Like, he has no psychology degree or anything. It's actually quite a miracle that he got a job in the FBI. He didn't have a degree. He just like, I really want to do this. And he actually, the person that was the recruiter was like, yeah, right. Too bad, kind of thing. But she's like, he wouldn't give up. And so she said, okay, why don't you try to volunteer at a suicide hotline? And he did that for a while, and he learned a ton. about talking to people and negotiating. And all that to say, it got him into actually doing some really high profile. I mean, any hostage negotiation is a high profile because somebody's life's on the line, but he did a lot of stuff. All that to say, he gives all of his secrets in this book on how to actually negotiate for what you want. And this is where the answer to your question comes in. What I'm thinking that might help add to that conversation is using in the conversation, using like questions like what and how versus why, or we need to. And the point is when you can ask, he calls them calibrated questions. Like, how am I supposed to do that? Or what does it look like if we did this? Those are questions that aren't confrontational. Those are non-confrontational questions that will help you get kind of what you're asking for. And the main thing you want to really strive for is you want it to kind of be make them feel like it's their idea. Honestly, you're going to get so much further if you can just present some really good questions like this in a non-confrontational way that gets them thinking and gets them going like, wow, we really should do this. Like, and here's the other thing he says in the book too. It's a great book. I just read it, so it's all fresh, all this information. He's like, you don't want to get your counterpart to say you're right, because you're right is a passive yes, right? Like, you're right. You want them to go, that's right. Because then it's like, that's a collective yes. Everybody's in on that. So I think that will really help your communication and your meeting with the developers.
I wish I could speed read.
It's an audiobook. It is so good. I was compelled. He tells testimonies about kind of actual hostage negotiations that he was able to get the hostages free using these tactics. It's amazing. But here's the thing, like we're not, very few of us will become hostage negotiators, but we're always negotiating in life. Every day there's a negotiation with somebody we're talking to, right? Whether it's ordering a meal or even asking for a raise or talking to your team, right? Trying to get stuff greenlit, and it's all negotiating. So I highly recommend it, folks.
There's also a lot of nuance
Yeah.
in those negotiations, depending on the organization you're in and the type of person that you're talking to. The sort of developer lens that is common or typical is that accessibility requires more work. And just like I said earlier, it's not when you start from the beginning. But one of the things that developers are also tasked with is making things more performant. And not only more performant for the end user by making things load fast, but more performant in the operational side of producing and shipping code, right? So when you make things accessible, you are winning on both of those scales because it's usually less code. To use a semantic element and an attribute, the browser and assistive technology are going to immediately be able to handle those things versus writing a custom element or a div and then having to throw a whole bunch more code at it in order to make it accessible. Because then you amplify the volume of human work to write that code, you amplify the volume of user agent work to process that code, and then your performance suffers. So it's a win-win-win to just do it right in the first place. And if you can frame it that way for someone who cares about those things, then the developer is going to say, oh yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's do it this simple way.
Okay.
Thanks, Muriel. Great question.
Thanks for the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. This is an interesting question from PX. And I totally kind of felt his pain when he asked this question. He emailed me this question too. Is there a more usable website than the W3C that you can suggest? Seems to be the main go-to site, or am I overlooking a key one? And I got to say, I have so much respect for folks. I know, Charles, I know you read the spec. I know folks like Aaron Gustafson and a lot of the other really respectable web developers that have really shaped our field, I know they read the spec. Jeremy Keith comes to mind, and like there's a lot more. There's a lot of women too. I just can't think of right now that read the spec too. Like Rachel, I want to say Rachel Andrews, like she's a big part of that. And so I totally feel his pain. It's not a usable website. Why? Why is the, and it's been like that from the beginning. Why have they not made that better?
Well, there's a really long answer there, but the silver lining is it won't be that way for long.
Okay.
So
you know something we don't.
Yeah. So when you say that the W3C, that's a really broad description. What is typically meant is the actual success criteria, the actual recommendation, the WCAG 2.1, the spec itself. But the spec itself is just one layer in that information, right? Because that comes with the understanding docs. So the understanding docs is where some things are put into context and examples are given, and fail cases and success cases are given. But that tends to get pretty verbose and a pretty big learning curve and burden for someone to go through 78 success criteria and then read a whole bunch of understanding documents that go with each. It's a lot. So there are many people who have rewritten them, myself included. I wrote them in layman speak, and then I wrote them in quick, super simple sentences for our team to digest. And I'm happy to share those. There are sort of middle ground descriptions. Alan Dalton wrote a great article of WCAG 2.1 for people who've never read it. It was part of article series on accessibility a couple of years back. We can find that link and share it afterward. But the silver lining is literally silver. So the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group has a task force called Silver, which is also a community group, and I am a member of that. And the charter of that group is to create the new guidelines that supersedes WCAG. So everything that is a challenge that we learned from research and that we hear from the public on how difficult the actual guidelines are for people, and the irony is that they're not very accessible, all those issues are being resolved. So the working group is working on WCAG 2.2 as we speak. The timeline for that will be pretty fast, much faster than we went from 2.0 to 2.1. We'll go from 2.1 to 2.2. And then shortly after 2.2, we're hoping that the world will see silver.
That's awesome. I feel like we got a nice little sneak peek there into what's coming. That's really exciting. Jack Riddell, who's also a community member, he had a comment and a couple questions. And Charles, I pasted it in the chat for easier reference. But he said one comment and a couple questions. He wanted to thank you again for sharing accessmovie.org with all of us. It's just incredible. I fully agree. That was really moving and super, super well done. And then his first question is, he's really curious about the fog model note in your presentation. You may need to explain that briefly, but he's familiar with the concept, but would love to hear more about how you've applied it to this context.
Yeah, so I answered that in the thread in the group, so it may help for others to go back and refer to that. But the short answer is the fog model. For those that don't know, BJ Fogg is a behaviorist basically, and wrote a great deal that we still use today in the user experience realm on how to change people's behavior. And he identified that behavior change relies on only three things. One is motivation, One is the trigger, and what's the
Is it the reward?
what am I missing?
The reward? Cue, trigger, reward.
It's, yeah. So it's the ability. So it's
that's right, yes.
the ability to do the behavior, the motivation to do the behavior, and a prompt or a trigger, right? So the way this works out for accessibility is ability is easy to cover by training and helping people learn how to make things accessible. I say that it's easy. I understand it's not easy for everyone. The motivation is things that I've talked about making it personal, right? Because it's different for everyone. It's your why. The trigger is the one that I've been using for the past 3 or 4 months now is the WebAIM Million report, which a lot of our industry has thankfully spoken to, including well-respected people like Ethan Marcotte, who published, just after that report came out, he published an article called "The Web We Broke," participating in ownership of the fact that, you know, we're all to blame. So I've been using that as the trigger, as the motivation, saying, hey, look, you know, it's clear, we have irrefutable evidence that the web is broken. So let's take that ability and that personal motivation and change our behavior. So I think that's how the FOG model applies to this, at least for me, and how I'm approaching teaching accessibility in my organization and as an activist.
I love it. I love it. Let's use our abilities to make a difference. Let's use the abilities we have, and we all can make a difference here. And I think that's kind of the overarching point, right? We all can and should. And
every difference matters, right? So here's a good example. That report showed not only the fact that 97.8% of the home pages of the top 1 million sites had easily detectable or programmatically detectable accessibility issues, but it helped break down what issues. So it pointed out the number of instances of color contrast, for example. 33% of those sites that had easily detectable errors were simply missing the language attribute. It's 9 characters of text at the top of an HTML document. That is a very low-hanging fruit that is easy to go and fix, and you just, you know, solved the reading voice for 33% of the web.
Wow.
So there is a lot of opportunity out there, and every step matters. There was a second question in there, wasn't there?
Yeah, let's skip to we're running out of time here. Let's go. Jack also had a question about the Domino's case. I thought that was interesting because that's
following it
national
very very closely. I can tell you it's not on the Supreme Court docket schedule yet. They haven't acknowledged that they're going to hear it yet, and it'll be very public once they do.
I read a headline. It was on the AY11 newsletter. Mm-hmm. It said Domino's would rather go to the Supreme Court than make its website accessible to the blind. That sounds preposterous to me.
It does. Yeah, there's no way they come out on top here. So not to take a whole bunch of time on the legal aspect of it, but there's no way this is a lose-lose situation for them. The face that they're losing over this is not worth it, because they've basically just told the world they don't care.
It's just too bad. And basically, for anybody who doesn't know, Domino's is being sued for being a public website that serves the public. They're set up that way. And there's an issue where a screen reader wasn't interpreting. It wasn't allowing people with visual disabilities to actually use the website, right? Is that correct? And they got sued, and now they're going, instead of fixing the problem, they're willing to just take this to the Supreme Court. It just sounds ridiculous.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. They got sued. They filed an amicus brief to dismiss the case, and the case was dismissed. That decision was appealed, and the appeal stuck. And because the case was allowed to proceed, that's when they filed the brief to the Supreme Court. So instead of just accepting the fact that, hey, this is very real and we can do something about it, they'd rather kick it up a notch and keep fighting.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have a couple minutes left here, Charles. I guess what I wanted to ask you is kind of, while we're sort of going in, and great questions today, everybody, really, really great questions, a lot of value added to this conversation. And Charles, thank you for the super insightful answers to all of these. Before we go, I just feel like I want to leave this conversation with you telling us, Charles, just about kind of some of your most impactful stories. Like, I want to know, because you are obviously so passionate about this, and I love your passion about this. It's really contagious. And so I always, obviously, I want to tell you to keep fighting on. But I want to ask you, as we close here, can you tell us the most impactful story that you've personally experienced of practicing accessibility and inclusive design and/or inclusive design? And maybe, if there's time, a favorite story of you've seen of others practicing this.
Wow. I probably should have prepared for a question
Sorry.
that impactful. The sad answer is I don't have one. Like I said, every incremental step forward matters. It does. It makes a big difference. And that's what I see. And I have to accept that that's okay. The way that I tried to frame this in a talk that I gave recently is it's far more impactful for all of us to collectively decide to do something, to do a thing, that even if it's that low-hanging fruit, than it is for 10 of us to go out and make a perfect site. Right? The amount of human impact that has is far greater. So if we can all just do something, right? Like if it's removing some jargon from your copy, or improving some color contrast somewhere, or making things that move able to be stopped by people that are impacted by that. All of it matters. So I see each one of those little individual efforts as a big impact, because we can't get a switch to flip and have the world be accessible overnight. But when we see things that make a change and make a human impact, we should be recognizing them and following them. There's a second part of your question.
Just an examples, maybe something that's really impacted you that you've seen others do in accessibility and or inclusive design that's really impacted you personally.
I can tell you things that make me feel good, that aren't necessarily impacting me personally yet. As I mentioned, I'm losing my vision. So Microsoft made an application called Seeing AI, which absolutely makes me feel good. It's wonderful technology. It's super smart, it's super efficient, and it's getting better every day. And it helps people with visual disabilities in all kinds of situations. It can read the label off of a pill bottle for you. It can, recognize faces in a room. It can do all kinds of wonderful things. So that kind of technology, I'm really excited about, but I'm also looking at a time where I may be dependent on it. And then similarly, Google worked on a program that is basically reading off text. And it is, I can't remember the name, Euphenia, I think was the name of the project, Google Project Euphenia. And that turned into a product that is essentially a built-in screen reader. And the coolest thing about that is their why behind it. The fact that the entire process was inclusive from the beginning. They didn't just, set out to make a product that worked on behalf of hearing impaired people. A bunch of hearing impaired people got together and made a product with each other.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. That's inspiring. So Charles, thanks. I want to add one thing, and this is something that Alan Cooper mentioned in the interview that we did a while back. And he said something really impactful. I mean, he said a lot of impactful things in the interview, but one of the last things he said was just about making a difference. And he's doing this whole thing called Be a Good Ancestor. He's up there in years, right? He's been around. He's been on the earth for a long time. He's really thinking a lot about his legacy. He's really thinking a lot about how he's going to be remembered. And I appreciate that a lot. And he said something to me. He said, you can't divert a major river at where it's already flowing. You have to go to the mountain, and you have to dig. You have to dig at where the river starts to reroute it. And so I just feel like all of these things, I feel like maybe we're at the middle of the mountain right now. Maybe we're kind of climbing. We're at the middle, but let's keep climbing up that mountain to divert these waters to the right place. Yeah, and Charles, absolutely. I thank you for doing that. Thank you for being one of thankfully many people that are really trying to do this and doing it. So thanks for being here, man. Thanks. This has been really super powerful and enlightening and inspiring. And I can't wait to share the replay with everybody who couldn't be here today. But yeah, do you have any last words for us before we go?
Just there's a parallel, common expression that goes along with what you just said, which is shift left, right? So we have spent the last 2 generations looking at accessibility from the tail end and noticing when things are broken and going backwards to fix them. So the more we shift left to the beginning of a process and divert that from its source, the better off we'll be, and the less effort it takes.
I love it. Thanks, Charles. Last but not least, and thanks everybody for being here. I just want to say, fight on, my friend.